Yes, so hopefully by the end of these 30 minutes, you'll have a good understanding of how New York City government works. And yeah, let's just get started. So New York City government is, it's like a complex organism. It has 330,000 employees, countless departments. And so the goal of our fall semester was, how does this thing work? First, let's talk about what it does. So New York City government, out of the federal, state, and local government, runs more of the day-to-day things in our lives, whether it be schools, parks, libraries, hospitals, and then city services that we don't really think about too much, but are a big part of our day-to-day life. In the United States, the government is split up into different branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, for checks and balances. That's called separation of power. And then also on the federal, state, and local level, which is called federalism. So on the federal level, that's the president, Congress, and courts. On the state level, that's analogous to the governor, state legislature, and state court system. What's interesting is on the local level, it can be even more divided. Usually when you just have small towns, it's just the local level. But for the city, the local level is divided on the city, borough, and district level, with the mayor and city council, the borough president, borough boards, and district attorneys, and community boards at the lowest level of federalism for community districts. So you might be asking why there's all of this separation of power for New York City. And what's nice about separation of power is it makes change easier to occur. So if you just had the mayor and city council, if you wanted changes to the law or you wanted any sort of change to your neighborhood, it would have to go straight to the city level, which is a very high entrance barrier. But if you can go to your community board, and then the community board recommends it to the borough president and borough boards, and then all of a sudden it ends up in City Hall, it's much easier for that sort of flow of change to occur, which is a benefit of this division of power. So we're going to start off with the mayor because he's the most important part of the government. The mayor has a lot of power in that he oversees, or she, not yet. We were actually very close to getting a female mayor in the last election with Catherine Garcia. But anyway, the mayor oversees the city agencies, which is a big role. The mayor can create agencies, destroy agencies, appoints all the heads, which are called commissioners. And because this is such a big job, the mayor appoints deputy mayors to act as intermediaries. And the mayor also represents New York City on the federal and state level. Outside of New York City, the mayor may go on trips to officially represent the voice of New York City. And also the mayor can veto any bills coming out of city council. Here are some recent mayors. You may recognize some of them. What's interesting about mayors is that a lot of them were elected in response to what their predecessor was bad at doing. So, for example, Dinkins was elected after Koch because Koch was bad at managing race relations. And then Giuliani was elected after Dinkins because Dinkins was unable to manage the Crown Heights race riots, and Giuliani came in as someone tough on crime. And then Bloomberg was elected after Giuliani. I'm sorry, de Blasio was elected after Bloomberg and Giuliani because there had just been 5 Republican terms, and the city wanted a especially liberal mayor. And then you can go even further to Adams, who was elected after defund the police, which was pretty unpopular by the time the election rolled around. So here's a list of some of the major departments. The Department of Education runs the biggest school system, public school system in the world. We've got the police department, the fire department. The fire department also manages ambulances. Department of Buildings, Health and Hospitals. New York City has a large free hospital system as well. Department of Transportation, Sanitation, City Planning, Design and Construction, Consumer Worker Protection, to protect workers, and also the city sets wage levels. the Housing Authority, Housing Preservation and Development, the Department of Environmental Protection, the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, and it just keeps going on and on. So next up, we have the City Council. The City Council passes bills, which then become local laws, and also manages the budget. The City Council is also involved in land use matters, and each council member also has their own discretionary budget, which they can use in local neighborhood projects. But first, let me talk about who's in the City Council. There are 51 council members. Although they're mostly Democrats, they each have their own sorts of priorities. So you could think of them as being different flavors of Democrats. A Democrat for Brooklyn is very different from a Democrat in the Bronx. And even within boroughs, they have their own issues. I visited City Council a number of times. It was kind of fun. You can go there if you want. It's open to the public. New York City, on the citywide level, the government also has a number of accountability features. So we have the controller, just like in other governments, which audits the budget. The Independent Budget Office also does that. And then there's an interesting position called the public advocate, which is rather unique to New York City government. It's basically just an elected position. It's right now filled by Jumaane Williams. And his job is to advocate for the citizens and any change that he wants to happen, and also be a platform for citizens and address any problems that the city government might be creating. The public advocate is an elected position and is independent from the mayor and city council, which sort of acts as balance of power there. There's also the Conflict of Interest Board, which I love. They create rules around conflict of interest, such as, you have to disclose if you have financial stake in something, and if you break those, they'll come after you and publicly shame you. And just like other governments, there's a campaign finance board. This has not stopped there from being a lot of corruption in New York City government. There is a lot of corruption, and it sucks. But there are some accountability measures within the government. Yeah, come on in. Hey. So now that we've talked about the citywide level, we're going to talk about the borough level, starting with the borough presidents. Now, the borough presidents used to have a lot more power before 1989. But right now, they've sort of been stripped of a lot of their official powers. So their really only remaining official powers are that they have a role in the budget and land use process, called ULURP, which we'll talk about a little later, and that they appoint community board members. And because of that sort of lack of official role, it's become a self-defined position, where the borough presidents have sort of chosen what they want to do with their position. And that can be advocating for community issues, funding projects, because they do have a discretionary budget, and then also just going to the city council and asking for legislation to be passed. Here are the current borough presidents. It would be good if you knew your borough president. They're a little bit involved in local affairs. We also have the borough boards, which consist of the borough president, city council members, and the chairs of every community board within that borough. They resolve issues between community boards and also address borough-wide concerns and are involved in the budget process. Now, just like the rest of the United States, every county has a district attorney, except in New York City, boroughs are the counties. So we have district attorneys, which act as the prosecutor if someone breaks the state law. And if you break the federal law, there are U.S. attorneys for the Southern District of New York and the Eastern District of New York. The district attorneys are also elected by the people, whereas the U.S. attorneys are nominated by the President of the United States. Okay, now that we've talked about the borough level, we're going to go all the way down to the bottom of federalism here with the community district level. So there are 59 community boards, each with 50 residents, and they are the voice for the neighborhood. They're just normal residents who live there who are interested in issues in their community. While they don't have any official power, they make a lot of recommendations to city agencies and are often consulted for different licenses. It primarily has been liquor licenses, but recently with all these new marijuana shops, there's been a lot of consulting around marijuana licenses. That's sort of actually been a little bit of a disaster, which I could talk about later. But yes, the community boards are consulted for those licenses. Community boards also create resolutions. They write and pass resolutions to different agencies for what they want to see happen. And each community board has committees. And since each community district has its own issues, I think it's interesting in talking to different community board members from different districts that they all have different committee structures and different foci. So in my community district, we're focusing a lot on climate resiliency because Lower Manhattan was flooded pretty bad in Hurricane Sandy, and we want to protect it. So we've had a lot of meetings with the relevant groups that are constructing flood walls. But in another district, that's just simply not an issue. And they might be worrying about a local museum that's opening up or something like that. Community boards are also the start of the budgetary process. They make budget requests. And yeah, the community boards meet every month, and then the committees within them also meet every month.
Want to tell us one thing about Community Board 1?
Sure.
Or 2, please?
Community Board 1, I really love all the community board members there. They're like friends to me. A lot of the members have been there for a very long time. They're sort of like the pioneers of living in Lower Manhattan because not many people lived there until recently, and they've been, yeah, they're like the original settlers, which is funny to think of that because, you know, it's Lower Manhattan. It's one of the first places that was settled for living. Yeah, you should go to a community board meeting in your district because they'll be talking about a lot of the buildings that are around you, and it's good to know about what's going on around you. And you can also apply if you want to be a community board member. So now that we've talked about the structure of New York City government, let's talk a little bit about some of the laws. So we have the charter, which is basically like the Constitution. You can think of it as that. It establishes the structure of the government and then the official powers and responsibilities of each part of the government. The administrative code consists of local laws that have been passed by the city council and signed by the mayor. And the rules are created by city agencies and are even more specific. Now let's talk about the budgetary process. The budget consists of an expense budget for day-to-day operations and personnel costs. As I said earlier, 330,000 people work for the city government, so that's a big personnel cost. And the capital budget, which is for construction and larger projects. The budget has to be approved every year, and it goes through the budgetary process, which starts at the community boards with the budget requests and the budget priorities, goes to the borough boards, which then send in their own priorities for the borough. That then goes to the city council, which makes their recommendations to the mayor, and then the mayor takes all of that and creates his own budget. And then finally, the council has to approve of it, but by that point, the negotiations are pretty minor. So this is what the budget looks like from the department level. The biggest portion of it goes to the Department of Education. And yeah, I'll just leave this up for a second for you to read over it. I think it's just good to know what the budget actually consists of. The second process I'll talk about is zoning. Before 1915, I believe, there were no rules regarding construction. You could just build whatever you want. There were some like pre-zoning like rules, but that was sort of primordial. It wasn't really made up yet. There were some rules around the tenements after some tenement fires, but for the most part, you could just build whatever you want until the Equitable building was built, and it was just this huge building, which was out of character for a neighborhood in Lower Manhattan. Actually, it's by my house, pretty close by. And after that, the city decided to pass some zoning rules, which then evolved later in 1961 into our current zoning resolution. So zoning consists of a map, which color codes each part of the city into residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, and open space areas. And then also the zoning resolution, which has rules for what can happen in each of these different categories of land. And yeah, this is maintained by the Department of City Planning. But if you want to change the zoning process, you have to go through ULURP, the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. And we have some of those in the community board. Let's say you want to build a new building that's not currently allowed in the zoning code. You'd have to go through this to modify the zoning code to allow you to do that. It starts at the community boards. A developer will come by the community board and say, here's my plan. Are there any comments? Would you like to see any modifications? And often community boards will try to get concessions out of that. Then we have a 30-day process at the borough level. Again, concessions, modifications. Then the City Planning Commission looks it over. City Council looks it over. They might have hearings, all that sort of stuff. And then the mayor signs it. And at each one of these levels, you have to make sure that these groups are happy and modifications are made. And yeah, that's how zoning works. One of the things I want to point out that's interesting is the New York City government is constantly shifting in its structure. It didn't always used to be this way. I mean, it started off with aldermen, yeah, but the most recent changes here are when the Board of Estimate was dissolved. That was a huge change in 1989. Before that, the government was essentially ruled by a smoke-filled back room filled with the mayor, the borough president, the controller, and the president of the city council. Without any, there wasn't really press in there, so you had no idea what was going on. And it wasn't very democratic. But in 1989, the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional. Actually, not because it was undemocratic, in that people didn't know what was going on, but that the borough presidents of Brooklyn, which was the most populous, had the same amount of power as the borough president of the Bronx in Staten Island. But anyway, the Board of Estimate was gotten rid of at that point, and the government was restructured to give more power to the city council and the mayor. And since then, there's been a lot of a trend towards decentralization. So community boards have more power, and yeah, the government has gotten more democratic and more accountable. There was also a change in 1993, putting a 2-term limit on citywide officials. That was briefly changed for Bloomberg and then changed back. But that is quite a large change because, at least on my community board, which also had term limits recently put in place, before then, a lot of the members of the government would just stay there for life. They'd have their entire career in that position. And now you can only be in there for 8 years before you have to shift to a new position. So it does sort of change the character of the government. We have some shifts in how education was structured. Again, more decentralization from a Board of Education to the Department of Education. But besides it just being a different agency, it was more decentralized. The actual agencies changed. So 311 was created, and now it's grown quite a lot. And yeah, in 2014, not a big deal, but community board age was lowered to 16. And there are few people I know of who've been on the community board below 18. So that's been pretty fun. The jail of Rikers Island was, in 2017, it was decided that we were going to replace it with borough-based jails. I know, Charlie, you probably have a lot to say about that. Yeah, that's changing the criminal justice system quite a bit. And hopefully there'll be more ethical jails. And there's also been a trend in the last few decades towards out-contracting. So instead of the city running operations, they're paying nonprofits and companies to run them. So a bigger and bigger part of the budget is towards paying non-governmental groups to do the work. And yeah, who knows what it'll be like in 2050, because it just keeps changing. New York City has faced varying issues. So just like the structure of the government has changed a lot, the issues that New York City government have also changed a lot. We have, a decline in manufacturing. Some people thought that's the end of the city. What is New York City going to do now? Their economy has just been changed. The loss of middle-class blue-collar jobs was a big part of that. In the 1970s, New York City actually went bankrupt, and there's that famous headlining, Fort to City, drop dead. The city had no money, and it just, again, it looked like the end of New York City. But New York City persevered. And then we had 9/11, which was a huge catastrophe, and New York City persevered. So through all these issues, people have said, and people are saying now, again, it's the end of New York City, because New York City is, again, out of money. But New York City's kept persevering, and through all these challenges, it has managed to overcome them. So I have faith in New York City in overcoming current problems, which are flooding. As sea level rises, New York City is going to have to prepare itself for that. The migrant crisis is a big issue right now. Office workers, there's a lot of empty office space now because people are working more from home, which has been a big shift in the real estate industry. And also that affects the city because the city can't collect taxes from that. And a lack of affordable housing. Right now, we have a quite large problem where there's just not enough affordable housing and rents are just too high. And yeah, the biggest issue right now is that the city is out of money because federal aid that came in from COVID has dried up. And so Adams has been enacting a lot of budget cuts. So they did a 5% budget cut last year. They're going to most likely keep doing 5% budget cuts, which has meant cutting of a lot of programs and a lot of controversy. Like Adams did cut some funds towards the Department of Education, and people got so upset he had to put those back. But then the question is, now what are you going to cut? Because the city can't run on a deficit. It has to have equal money coming in as money coming out, with some asterisks attached. And then another issue is gentrification. Mr. Kildall and I watched a documentary about downtown Brooklyn and how it got gentrified, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but the bad part was that it displaced a lot of the people of color that had lived there instead of integrating them into the new neighborhood. And it's kind of sad if people have set their roots in there and they're entirely erased. And I've also seen that in Lower Manhattan. So it's something to be aware of. All right, so now let's talk about what you could do. First, I want to talk about voting because the turnout in local elections is pretty low. In the last city council election in my district, there was only a 7% turnout, which means that your vote actually has a big impact. Because if other people aren't voting, then you have a bigger say in the election. So yeah, that's 7% in local elections, at least in my district, compared to around 65% consistently for the federal elections of the president. You could also become a community board member. I have to say it's pretty fun. It sounds boring at first, but it gets very interesting. There's always something new every month. If you don't want to be a full board member, you can be a public member, which just means you can see one committee meeting every month and just vote in that committee. So it's like being a community board member, but even less work. And yeah, besides that, you could just attend a community board meeting and just see what it's like. Get to know some of your local neighborhood issues. And also, given that climate resiliency projects are being developed right now, especially by like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and different areas, it's important that you submit comments on what you think about them, because it's really going to change how New York City feels. We're not going to have that same water view necessarily in all neighborhoods. So you might want to submit some comments on what you think about what is currently being planned in your neighborhood. And I want to end here with some lessons that I've learned. I don't think it's really easy to find any of these in writing. You just sort of get to know them by talking to different people. Yeah.
I know the second one is from our class.
Yes, the second one is from the one and only Mr. Kildall. The third law of historical motion. It's a great mnemonic. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. In other words, every big change has pushback. And yeah, we saw that theme in how the mayors are elected. The Wendy Chapman rule, I named it after the community board member and my friend Wendy Chapman, who just told me from her experience that city government officials tend to move in unison. So they'll go from not paying attention to you or saying no to all of a sudden all of them are saying yes and asking about it. And that's what happened to her when she was trying to, I believe it was when she was trying to prevent a school from being closed. The Ron Kim rule, we spoke to Assemblyman Ron Kim, again, thanks to Ms. Horowitz. He said that it may be easier to make your opponent's voters not turn out to vote than it is to excite voters to vote for you, which is really kind of sad. But I've definitely seen this in a lot of local elections, that the people who want to come in and win the elections, instead of trying to get people excited to vote for them, I mean, they do that. They bash their opponents, and then their opponents' voter base is less excited to vote, and so they just don't turn out. And that just drives turnout lower and lower and lower. But it's an easier strategy in some cases than it is to get people to vote. And that was not only in his case, but is also in my case, in my district, and so I'm going to generalize that rule. Also, the backstage decision rule. A lot of decisions are debated in private before they are made public. So, excuse me, just getting over a cold. So, for example, in the city council, the speaker doesn't want to bring something to the floor unless they're confident that it's going to be a yes, and not just by a simple majority, but like a fair majority of people would vote yes. And a lot of the discussion that convinces people actually happens behind stage. Because if they do it in the real meeting, everyone can watch it. So they just decide in advance. And then at the real meeting, it's kind of boring because everything's all been scripted out. And they vote and just say what they want to say. And that's not only in the city council, it also happens in the state government quite a bit. And one final thing that it's a little bit annoying actually, is that there's so many different groups that govern the same area. So this is just an excerpt from one of our community board resolutions that illustrated this. The Rotary, which is a park, is under multiple jurisdictions, including the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey at the Rotary Center, and the New York City Department of Transportation and Department of Parks and Recreation at the perimeter, requiring the transformation of this area to have agreement from all agencies, all of whom the designers confirm are aware of the proposals. So it just means that anytime you want to do something, even if it's just a small project about one park, you have to get all of these different agencies on board. And it's, yeah, that's what you get from a bureaucracy. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation. I really want to thank Mr. Kildall for making this a very enjoyable experience, and for putting in energy with me, and also all the speakers who took the time to speak to us out of their busy schedule. And thanks for listening. I hope you learn more about New York City government.